so I'm on, I hope I'm streaming for special topics. I'm just going to do a very quick thing about how the U.S. got involved. But before I get to that, let me show you a picture. This one blew me away. So, it's Cap. Right there, laying on the guy's back. He has just been arrested. So these are the police. I don't know what country it is. And they have him on his back, and the cat came and just laid on the guy's back while he is handcuffed. Here's a close-up of it. Here he is, handcuffed. Yeah, I'm still trying to figure that one out. But, right there, the cat laying on his back while he's handcuffed. That is awesome. So, on that note, just a couple things about the advisors. One of the reasons, sorry, I'm just setting things up as we go. I hate these little laptops we gotta use. Give me a sec, I'm sorry. Okay, so if you have any questions, please ask. It might be a little bit late. Remember, there's about a 5 or 6 second delay. So what I want to do is cover a couple things about how the United States got involved in the Vietnam War. Part of the reason, I'm just turning my phone on so I can look at the screen. I'm glad you like the cat. Yeah, that cat just, it's a nice place to lay. This guy's not going anywhere. So one of the things I really liked about the fog of war is it lays out all these inconsistencies about why people go to war and real lessons. I think they're pretty good lessons about why or what people should be thinking in situations including today. Empathizing with your enemy, that number one, the United States never really understood, yet at the Cuban Missile Crisis they did understand. It's a huge problem today, where people don't really understand where their opponents are coming from, especially in this very weirdly polarized country where there's a lot of polarization between the parties in a country where half the population doesn't vote. So it's a confusing place. The parties are weak and yet polarized is the best way to look at it here. And another thing about watching that, I'm just going to remind you, there's that one question about, don't answer the question they ask. McNamara says, answer the question you want. He never, you notice that he always kind of, let me go back, let me do this. Everyone does that. But it's a great strategy. If you want people to persuade them to your point of view, they ask you a question, kind of push them along a little bit. Saying that, if I ask you a question in the exam, it might not work for you. And it is a little duplicitous. But he lays out, that's what I like about that fear of nuclear war, but also tying it into firebombing. How much the United States bombed Japan, and was that proportional to what the war was being fought about and how to win the war? I mean, the war was won by August. And yet the United States was not only still firebombing, they would drop the 2 biggest firebombs, 2 atomic bombs, and blockading and starving civilians, etc. Also, he talks about the Cuban Missile Crisis, how close they came to nuclear war, and that was in their mind during the build-up to war and the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. And so Eisenhower started making this important by sending 1,000 advisors. There's a Green Beret right there, Special Forces. Kennedy loved the Green Berets. He loved that idea of going into action and doing counterinsurgency action and learning different languages. They called it COIN, counterinsurgency. And they would send these men in. They would get a name called brushfire wars or sometimes proxy wars, as allies of the U.S. would fight allies of the Soviets, even though this was much more complex than that. But that's the way they looked at it. This is one of the things where even McNamara said that he believes that Kennedy would have acted differently. Maybe. You can't prove anything different, but it's hard to imagine considering the Cold War. But Kennedy came in and he increased the number of advisors from 1,000 to 16,000. Kennedy came in as a full-fledged Cold Warrior. The U.S. began their biggest arms buildup in their peacetime arms buildup in their history while Kennedy was president. The United States technically was not in any war, and yet Kennedy built up the forces more, talked about different ways of using the military, bragged about it, dramatically increased nuclear weapons, and dramatically increased the number of men involved in war. Sure, Kennedy might have gotten out of Vietnam, but I just don't see how. How can you pull out of a war that you said is worth 16,000 advisors and millions of dollars as part of the greater war against communism, which must be a major war because we're putting enough nuclear weapons in Montana to destroy the world? It just would have been hard. A lot of that, I think, is just fantasy. Maybe though, because Kennedy was killed. But advisors are coming in, and advisors were soon in action. In fact, they presented this as a great new weapon of the Cold War. In fact, Kennedy called his military idea the flexible response. We're not just going to use nuclear weapons or tanks on the plains of Germany. We will respond wherever around the world. Kennedy's program was an escalation of the Cold War. Even though he constantly talked about we're doing this so we can have peace down the road. But Kennedy did that. Now, did he believe that? I kind of think so. There's no doubt he liked it. But also remember, Truman was hammered over China. And then Eisenhower was hammered over Cuba. Kennedy did not want to be hammered over Laos or South Vietnam. And the election was coming in 1964. So, that is a U.S. Army plane dropping it's a South Vietnamese Ranger for a landing into Viet Cong supply lines. It's in South Vietnam. Most of the fighting's in South Vietnam. And the United States began to build up what they called strategic hamlets. And this became the idea to help the South Vietnam, help the South Vietnamese army. Here was a big problem the South Vietnamese army was having. The Viet Cong could control the countrysides. The Viet Cong were gaining popular support. The Viet Cong wanted one Vietnam, which the vast majority of South Vietnamese wanted. And so when the South Vietnamese army would go out and try to look for, Viet Cong, when the South Vietnamese army would look for them, they didn't know who was who. They knew that they were being helped by South Vietnamese civilians, but they very well could be those South Vietnamese civilians. They could be farmers who were out there acting like a farmer, and then as soon as the South Vietnamese army left, they grabbed their gun. Or for that matter, they would go into villages looking for South Vietnamese. These are South Vietnamese soldiers in South Vietnamese villages. They can't find the Viet Cong. They move on. The Viet Cong would roll right back in. They couldn't find them. So this became the great idea of the United States. The U.S. would fund, and it'd be carried out by the South Vietnamese. They would take all the villagers in an area and bring them into one spot. They called it a strategic hamlet. And then they would fortify that so it could not be attacked by the Viet Cong. They would train militia. They would have barbed wire, punji sticks. I'll show you punji sticks in a little bit later. A moat, a watchtower. And this would become a little fortified hamlet. So then they would go out and farm during the day, come in at night. That means anybody outside the hamlet is the enemy. Boy, that sounds like a good idea. A lot of people have done that. Let me give you an example. In Cuba, the Spanish did that to stop the Cuban guerrillas. And what they would do is they would concentrate villagers and put them in a village, and the idea is that anybody outside of it is the enemy. They had a name for it. I'm trying to think. They call them reconcentration facilities or concentration camps. Do you see the problem? They're going to create concentration camps. This was an unmitigated disaster. It failed. It angered the villagers. They took them from the villages that their family might have been on for hundreds of years, and at gunpoint forced them into being stacked on top of each other in an armed camp. And if you're inside of it, it doesn't look like that barbed wire is protecting you. It looks like it's a prison and you're being locked in. And so because of that, a failure. But it just gives an example how this ham-handed approach, all we have to do is that, then we could bomb outside. The point is, every time they did something like this, every time they attacked the village, the Viet Cong got stronger. Kennedy then kept sending more advisors. Okay, just a few more advisors. And one of the things they did is, they said that, okay, we're justifying this, not just in the Cold War, but you can see it right there. The SEATO, where the mouse is. The Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. This treaty, kind of like NATO, excuse me, I did drink of water, that the United States created to contain communism. We're justifying sending 16,000 men, as you see in that diagram right there. That's 1963 from Time magazine. Because the North is invading the South and we're defending our ally. We even had the U.S. 7th Fleet patrolling a little bit off the coast of South Vietnam, but right off the coast of North Vietnam to intimidate them so they would not help and aid the Viet Cong. And it was not going well at all. And then the Cold War heated up again. In 1961, while Kennedy is coming in, I almost forgot something. Sorry. I should have ate something. I'm getting hungry and wearing down. But because I did my other two classes right before this. It's weird how it takes more energy to do it in front of nobody, which is kind of weird, but it's true. Okay, in 61, I did not put a slide on this, but Kennedy carried out a plan from the Eisenhower administration to use Cuban exiles to overthrow the Castro regime. I mentioned Castro before. It failed miserably. A humiliating effort probably turned Castro fully into a totalitarian dictator, but that's another story. But it's humiliating. Kennedy and the premier of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, had a summit in Vienna, Austria, a few months later, and Khrushchev was furious that so many people in East Berlin were going over to the West and not coming back. Kennedy thought, I have to act tough, and I'm not going to let you bully me into isolating West Berlin. And so that summer, the East Germans, the Soviets, built the wall. The Berlin Wall. And there's a picture of the wall. There's a famous picture of an East German guard. This is a few years later, but jumping over the barbed wire to safety. And so they built this wall dividing East and West Berlin. So West Berlin is in the middle of East Germany, the old Soviet occupation zone after World War II. And so it became this isolated little place, very like an island within the communist world. And to many outside of the highest level of planning, this looked like the Soviets were surrounding West Berlin to invade it. In reality, this actually lessened tensions because it ended that people fleeing the east to the west because they couldn't get over the wall. But Kennedy knew he had to react strongly to this because people blamed him for allowing this wall to be built. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Logically, what could he do? World War III, kill millions and millions and millions and billions of people, which that's what would have happened. He was kind of stuck, but he had to act tough. And so he had to go to Berlin and say that I will defend West Berlin like it's part of the United States. I will defend this. By the way, now my sister-in-law and her family live just right there, but her husband grew up right here in the American occupation zone. He went over, would give his speech. Did I put that up there? There'd be a number of confrontations between U.S. and also British and French. They also occupied it, and Soviet forces. Kennedy would go to Berlin and give his famous speech, Ich bin ein Berliner, where he would announce that West Berlin, we will treat it just like the United States, and if the Soviets, if this wall is a precursor to an attack and the Soviets attack West Berlin, we will treat West Berlin like you're attacking New York City. Or, I'm going to say it, Wyoming. And so, we are saying that we will defend Europe like it's part of the United States. We mean it. We're telling the people of Western Europe, our NATO allies, that it might seem like an act of aggression, even though it did in reality lessen tensions, but it might seem like the Soviet aggression, and they might be next, and they were right on the front lines. We will defend them. We promise. We pledge. You can count on us. Do we mean it? It's going to get in the back of everyone's mind then. If we mean we're going to defend West Berlin, we have to prove it, that we are a credible defense against communism everywhere. I think you might know where this is leading. South Vietnam is happening at that same time. No, we did not say that he was a jelly donut. Ich bin ein Berliner, he got from Willy Brandt, the mayor of Berlin, and what it meant was, that was a very colloquial way of saying that he was a citizen of Berlin. But a Berliner is a jelly donut, but he was not saying it. Nobody thought he was saying it. That little card on there is that's from his note cards. Kennedy used note cards. President Reagan used note cards too. But he hasn't written out phonetically the German Ich bin ein Berliner. But while I was in Berlin, since it's such a joke that exists to this day, you might be able to see it in the picture. I bought this for €1.50, a sticker of a jelly donut saying, Ich bin ein Berliner. It's a clever joke. He did not say it, but let's go with the joke anyways. So, with that, great. I said I was hungry, now I mentioned donuts. That might not have been the best idea. So we are saying we're going to defend Berlin. This seems like a very aggressive action. And remember Cold War Truman Doctrine thinking. This is all being directed by, every revolution is being directed by the Kremlin. And while this is going on too, I almost forgot, across Africa, countries, former colonies were becoming independent, and some might be allies of the Soviets. Heck, the U.S. was involved with Belgium to assassinate the revolutionary leader, nationalist leader of the Congo, Lumumba, because they thought he might be a socialist. So, yes, that was have great repercussions down the road. Poor Congo, Zaire. At the same time, the United States, through the Attorney General Robert Fitzgerald Kennedy, were trying to assassinate Castro, the leader of Cuba that they tried to invade. And even using the mob, that's why the picture, see those guys at the table? That's members of the Giovanni family at this upstate New York resort, right before they were arrested. It's actually kind of interesting. Kennedy used the mob, the Kennedy administration, tried to enlist the mob to get rid of Castro, because Castro kicked out the mob, kicked them out of Havana. The mob set up a bunch of casinos there. That's how come Vegas became big, after they kicked them out of that. But at the same time, the Kennedy administration was going after the mob for racketeering. This is a top secret document that we released later about the Attorney General talking about mongoose. This elaborate idea about giving Castro exploding cigars, and some of it is almost just ridiculous. To put a chemical inside his sweatsuit so his hair all falls out, to give him LSD so he loses control while giving a speech. It was ridiculous. He hired a former lover to murder him when he was at the United Nations. They also had plans the U.S. would hijack a plane, claim they're Cubans, crash the plane into Miami, for example, or New York City, killing everybody else off and turning it into a bomb, and then blaming Castro. Now, this really didn't go that far, but that's pretty scary. If you wonder why people today, to this day, think, hey, the 9/11 attack was an inside job, it's because they heard about what they talked about with Castro. That was called Northwind. But anyways, this is going to lead to the next big crisis. We don't need to cover this in any detail. We're jumping. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, they talked about this in Fog of War, in those of you who had American history last year, went over this in class. Khrushchev, feeling vulnerable, put nuclear weapons into Cuba. The United States saw this as a direct threat, would lead to a blockade and near nuclear war. Castro, because of the threat of assassination in the Bay of Pigs, wanted these missiles to deter American attack. And I should add one thing very important to this. The Berlin Wall, to many in the West and the United States, seemed to show how the Soviets were aggressive. It showed the exact opposite. Let's go back a little bit here. If you have to build a wall to keep your people from running away, that means there's something structurally wrong with your system, and you're weak and scared. And the United States had significantly more bombers, nuclear weapons, and the first intercontinental ballistic missiles. We had a 10-to-1 advantage by the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev was scared and felt threatened when he did this. Khrushchev was threatened when he sent in weapons for the Cuban Missile Crisis. Remember, McNamara said in the video that we must empathize with our enemy, and he talked about Khrushchev wanting to save face, and that would eventually lead to the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, we didn't fully empathize with it. The United States never understood, and it's still pretty much common doctrine to this day, never understood how vulnerable the Soviets felt, how weak the Soviets felt. Doesn't mean the Soviet Union wasn't a monstrous state, but they felt weak and vulnerable. They weren't necessarily the aggressors. In fact, virtually every major weapon system created in the Cold War, the U.S. would invent first. The only ones would be MIRV, which were, a MIRV is a multiple individual reentry vehicles, maneuverable, or multiple individually maneuverable reentry vehicles. I know what you're thinking. Oh, of course, that's what MIRVs are. So you'll see more and more they'll put H-bombs, but they always put them on a missile. And missiles would have multiple warheads on them. And the Soviets were the first to do that. So instead of having just one warhead, they'd have 3 or even 10, 15 warheads. They could hit 15 different targets. So one missile, 15. That's why missile defense against a modern force, virtually impossible. It's a political scam. But both sides wanted to deter each other's attack. And so that's why they did the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the Cuban Missile Crisis ended. The United States and the Soviet Union came up with kind of an agreement. The threat of war was lessened a little bit. The Soviets would begin a massive arms buildup. The point about the Cuban Missile Crisis was you have all these threats. Cuban Missile Crisis, near nuclear war, the Berlin Wall, the seeming advancement of the Soviet Union. And I should add, while this is going on, the space race was going on. The Soviets seemed to be winning in that. They put the first man into space, the first man into orbit, the first spacewalk. Even though they were actually behind, they risked more than the U.S. and put men into space first. So all this feeling that the Soviets are winning the Cold War, and then at home, the civil rights movement. Kennedy's program was called the New Frontier. And in this program, very much a liberal, Kennedy was very liberal. Kennedy today, at least domestic policy, would be significantly more liberal than Joe Biden. And President Trump is one of, if not the most conservative presidents in American history. At least in the last 100 years. I mean, how do you compare him to Franklin Pierce? But Kennedy is much more liberal. He is closer to what Elizabeth Warren is. That should give you an idea how national politics have become more conservative, which is ironic. Well, we'll get to the politics later on. But the civil rights movement, he promised to end Jim Crow laws and segregation, but that had failed. In fact, virtually all of Kennedy's program had failed. By '63, there were the Freedom Riders you see in the left-hand corner that were trying to get people registered to vote, and they were being attacked in places like that outside of Birmingham, Alabama. The sit-ins to protest segregated restaurants.
Just a moment.
I don't know how this happened. All right, that's pretty funny. All of a sudden, my phone went to the little Siri thing and asked me, what is your question? I have no idea. I wasn't even touching it. The sit-ins in North Carolina to protest segregation. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom had taken place in August of 1963. Kennedy's programs were going nowhere. The civil rights movement and the demand for equal rights for all men, let's be very clear, this is 1963, was stalled. And there was a huge and growing backlash by whites against the civil rights movement, and Kennedy was being blamed. The civil rights movement was going on, and Kennedy's looking at re-election going, oh my God, we're not going to win. And this is going into '63. He is really worried. He feels weak because of the Berlin Wall. He feels weak because things aren't going well in South Vietnam. He feels weak because of the civil rights movement. In fact, the only thing he can hang his hat on is the massive arms buildup. All through the fall and winter of 1963, Kennedy's bragging about the brand new Minuteman ICBMs that are just going in Montana and also in North Dakota. And so, with all this, Kennedy is committing more and more resources and making South Vietnam important. Why? The domino theory. Also, Berlin. If we're going to defend our allies in Berlin, we must prove that we mean business by defending our allies in South Vietnam. Civil rights and being reelected. But I can't get back to that Berlin thing, because that's the domino theory in action. The idea that what's going on in Berlin have anything to do with the desire of the people of Vietnam to be one country. Virtually nothing, except for the fact that the Soviet Union and China is helping North Vietnam as they see it as a political move. If South Vietnam and North Vietnam unify, Berlin will not fall. In fact, it did not fall. But that was the thinking. But civil rights hung over everything. He looks weak. He looks desperate. So, Berlin. So, these will be similar to the issues that that Johnson would use as vice president. But, last thing. Part of the problem was seen as Zim. Zim was the president of South Vietnam, and I mentioned him before. He took power after the Geneva Accords. He did not allow for elections. The Civil War sprung up there in 1960. We got the National Liberation Front. He's the guy the United States is stuck with. Now, at first the U.S. was overjoyed by Zim because he was South Vietnamese. He had been against French resistance. In fact, he was kicked out of the colony. He was against French colonization, and he was kicked out of the country. Zem was perfect. If we have Zem there, it doesn't look like they're a puppet of the United States. The problem was Zem was incredibly unpopular. He was corrupt. He involved with nepotism. His family members got extremely rich. The army was very corrupt. I have a picture of that. The army was incredibly corrupt. Officers would be chosen by their political support of Zem or the amount of money they gave to Zem, and then money that would be divvied out to officers, for example, to buy supplies and pay their soldiers. Their supply system was pretty convoluted. They would pocket it and get rich. And so the army was corrupt. And the soldiers did not trust it. In fact, the army was kind of a disaster. They would draft people, and desertion was high. With bad morale, led to atrocities against other South Vietnamese, which created more rebels. And that is where you get the Buddhist monks burning themselves at anger over this corrupt administration. And lastly, Zem was Catholic. Being Catholic, that tied him into the French. And he seemed like, okay, now we have another corrupt official, like the French established, so they get rich. And he was getting rich. And the U.S. is stuck with him. And the U.S. ambassador, Kennedy's first ambassador, former General Maxwell Taylor, and then Henry Cabot Lodge, his next ambassador, were saying, we got to get rid of this guy. But they're stuck, because if the U.S. gets rid of him, it looks like the U.S. is creating a puppet. And then the war becomes exactly what the Viet Cong said. The U.S. is creating South Vietnam so they could be a puppet government for the United States, and it's a form of imperialism. And so, South Vietnamese generals came to this U.S. ambassador and to U.S. agents. The CIA was all over, making normally very bad judgment about what was going on. And they said, can we overthrow him? Can we overthrow him? And so General Big Nim Men, U.S. just called them Big Men. Big Men would lead this. It'd be the South Vietnamese army. They would overthrow Zem. Now the thing was, the United States went all the way up to Kennedy, and they gave tentative approval. But they said, we want to make sure that nobody knows the United States knew about it, and don't kill Zem. Let him escape, go into exile, so we could say this was a peaceful overturn of power. And then the other big thing they told men, act like you're a democracy. You know, come in, say we're going to have elections, constitution, we're doing it because we're getting rid of the corrupt dictator. Now, the U.S. was not directly involved, like operating this, but they're using U.S. weapons, they're using the umbrella of U.S. protection, and they would never have done it if President Kennedy said, don't do it. And so, this was the U.S. was very much involved. Well, they didn't. Zem tried to run away, tried to hide in a Catholic monastery. They drug him out, and in an armored personnel carrier, with hand tied behind the back, they beat him and then shot him and his brother. And they murdered him. Brutally murdered. That picture, if it's in color, I'm not going to show you the color, it's horrible. Brutally murdered him. And Men became the new president. And here's the thing. Nobody believed the United States was not involved. And that's what you got to get down. The U.S., everybody believed the U.S. was involved. And the U.S. was. But the U.S. didn't order it. It was one of those things where it's the problem when you have a puppet government. You're stuck with the puppet government. And now we're really stuck. And that's what I want you to get down. The United States is stuck with this puppet government. And so, we got a dictatorship. And now the U.S. has to back them up. Especially since everybody thinks we put them in power. If we don't back them up, they're already weak. Every 6 months there would seem to be a new government. And every 6 months the United States would say, This was a peaceful coup, and they're going to establish democracy and freedom in the United States. Big man was president like 4 times, and he would eventually escape to the United States extremely rich. So, with this disaster, we don't know what was going to happen because Kennedy was assassinated just 2 months later in November 1963. Now, one of the things about what happened with Zem is right after Zem was killed, the United States said Kennedy said we'll pull out 1,000 advisors. Why do you do that? Why do you do that? Sure, it might have been that we're trying to lessen our involvement. Sure, it might have been even a symbol to say we're winning the war. But the big thing is, we pull out 1,000 advisors to say that the coup, we're trying to imply the coup was successful and a better government's in place, and now we can win the war. It's much more complex if you look at it that way than just simply pulling 1,000 troops out or pulling 1,000 troops in. On that happy note, which we'll finish tomorrow, now we'll get to how the U.S. made this into a full-scale war. Don't forget civil rights. All right, I'm going to put up somewhere, I might collect these notes. Please read the next 2 sections. I already assigned the 3rd one, but the 4th one too. We're going to have a quiz on Friday. It's going to be on Teams. Over the next couple days, turn in the Fog of War. So you have to get the 11 lessons and an example from it. Some detail about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, what they knew, what they found out later. And then also a brief explanation about what was learned from Ford and firebombing. Oh, and don't forget, interviews due next week. All right, on that happy note, have a great day. I will see you tomorrow.